This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, all I know is this is a great format for us today because if you're like me, I've got a ton of snow and I haven't even dug out my car yet. So this is an awesome format to be able to go to meeting here. Last week we didn't meet officially because the college did have an official holiday, and so hopefully you were able to watch those my video that I posted from last year's session on section 3, and then also Becky's video there on section 3. So remember that was out there for you to view. I did have a few people who didn't do section 3 homework that is now past due. You do want to make sure that you take a look at the first quiz there, quiz sections 1 through 3, that is due tonight. So remember, don't wait till the last minute because you do get 2 opportunities to take it and the best grade will count. All right, so don't forget about that. You want to make sure you're watching all those due dates on all those materials there that are coming up due. So today we're going to start, we're going to get through section 4 and we might start getting into section 5. We'll see how far we can get into this. But today we're going to be talking about applications of per capita and proportions. So if you've watched the videos on per capita section 3, remember per capita means per person. We are going to be working with the proportions today, but we're going to be going into a little bit more detail. Though now we know how to set up a proportion. Now what do I do next with it? How am I going to use this to help me in everyday life? Remember, this class that's what it's all about. How am I ever going to use this math? So let's take a look here. I'm going to start I think I get into this format here, a little bit bigger here. So let's take a look at how can we use a proportion. Now, a lot of times we use proportion in what we consider what if scenarios. So take a look at the information I've got here. I've got the Midwest states here of Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, and Ohio. Now, if we're looking at the K through 12 education, so that's basically elementary, middle school, and high school. So this is the education expenditures by each of those states. And then here is the state population. All right, so we can take a look at that. Now we can use this idea of proportionality to compare different things here as we're going through. So let's take a look at this question. So it says, according to the table, Illinois spent $28.54 billion on the K-12 education from a population of 12.9 million. With a population of 6.6 million in Indiana, what would be the expected value of the expenditures if the two states were proportional? So now we can see what Illinois spent and what their population is. We can see the population of Indiana and we could see what they spent. But what if they spent the same just like Illinois spent? Would it be the same number that we see on this table or would it be different? That's what we're going to be doing. We're saying, what if? We're setting up a what if scenario. All right, so excuse me. The first thing we want to look at are what are the 2 items that I'm going to be setting up my proportion. So I've got the expenditures and I've got population here. Okay, so here we go. Here is Illinois, because remember, we're comparing Indiana to Illinois. So we want to use all of Illinois' information. So the 2 items that I'm setting up for my proportion are expenditure and population. And honestly, it doesn't matter, remember, what order these are in, as long as you use the same order on the opposite side of the proportion here. So you can see here that we fill in the numbers. And when we fill in the numbers, notice that Illinois expenditures are in the billions and Illinois populations are in the millions. So I'm not able to just use the abbreviated version of the number and just use these values like that because they're different units here. billions, and millions. So here's an idea where that scientific notation is probably going to be pretty doggone handy to use here. Okay, so now we're figuring out if the population is this in Indiana, what would be the expected value in Indiana here. So remember, we're doing what if Indiana spent just like Illinois. So we're going to solve the proportion just like we did in the last section. We're going to be doing the cross multiplication. So if you watched my video, remember, we're going to do the cross multiplication. So the numbers across from one another, we're going to multiply those and we're going to divide with the one opposite the x. Okay, it's always going to be that same order there. Okay, so if we do that correctly, we're going to find a number about $14.6 billion. So take a look. I mean, that's much more than Indiana spends. So if we were like Illinois, we would be spending way more money. All right, so these are ideas and ways that, we might set up proportions, and we might say, well, what if, we did something like this? Okay, so let's go backwards. Let's go in the opposite direction. If the amount of the expenditures in Illinois were proportional to Indiana. So now we're looking in the opposite way. So now we're saying, what if Illinois spent like us in Indiana? What's going to happen? So once again, what are my two items that I'm setting up in my proportion are the expenditures and the population. Okay, so on this side, we're going to have all of Indiana's numbers here. So here's the expenditures over the population. And remember, we're trying to figure out what if Illinois spent the same as Indiana. So we're still going to use their population, because the what if, the thing that we want to figure out, is the expenditures. So once again, you want to do those cross multiplications here. You're going to multiply these and you're going to divide with the one opposite the x. Watch your units there. It's probably a good idea to practice that scientific notation. And you should get something like $19.49 billion, which is considerably less than what they're spending now. All right, and it would make sense. Indiana is spending less than what Illinois is spending, so it should be a number that's less. So that last part I just said, does my answer make sense? It should be less in this case, where the previous problem, yeah, it should have been more, because if we were comparing to Illinois that spends more, Indiana will probably be more. So when you're looking at that proportion, remember, stop and think. Does my answer make sense for this situation? Because if it doesn't, then I probably set something upside down over here. I didn't follow the same order on both sides here. Okay, so use the value of the K-12 education in Ohio as proportional to that, and we're going to compare it with Kentucky. Okay, so if we're looking at that comparative to Kentucky, and by the way, hint, boy, these questions would be great quiz or test questions. Hint. Okay, so let's take a look. If we were going to be setting that up, okay, and what might we answer about this? Okay, so take a look and write that down. Okay, so we're comparing Kentucky. Okay, if Kentucky were proportional to Ohio. So we're saying if Kentucky. So Kentucky is the one we're trying to figure out a part of. Ohio is the one that we're comparing using all the information there. So that's how we find that there. And then how does this compare to the actual value? Well, you can actually do a subtraction problem and find the difference between that and explain something like that. So yes, on the exams, there are going to be parts where you're going to be asked to do an explanation, because I do hand grade all the exams. So I will be looking for an explanation that makes sense. And make sure your sentences are proper sentences, because a lot of times people put things up there that I have no idea what it means. Always go back and reread your sentences. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is the gross domestic product, and that's the GDP. Now, GDP, it's the market value of all these recognized final goods and services produced within a country. In other words, everything that we would need to live our everyday life. So the price of milk, the price of a haircut, the price of gasoline, doctor's visits, you name it, tennis shoes, anything. So these are the final goods and services. Now, the GDP per capita, it's the market value of those goods, and it's per person within those countries. So we're going to here's what basically somebody would, their GDP per person, and we're going to divide that. Now, GDP per capita is considered an indicator of a country's standard of living. So if you have a GDP per capita that's very high, you have a much higher standard of living than somebody who would have a lower number. So let's take a look at something like that. All right, so here we have a few different countries throughout the world: Australia, Canada, China, Madagascar, and the United States. Now, be careful when you're going to be working with these numbers. Always pay attention to the units. If the units are the same, then my life is so easy. It's a piece of cake. I just have to do my division. Remember, per capita means per person, divided by the people, and I get my answer. But in this case, I'm dealing with billions, then in millions, so I have to most likely put it in standard form or in scientific notation form. So be careful and pay attention to those units, otherwise your answer will be wrong. All right, so remember, GDP per capita means I'm going to be taking these billions of dollars in goods and services and dividing by the population here. All right, so you can see if I go through here, here would be GDP per capita for these various countries. So remember, I'm just dividing. I'm taking the GDP values and in billions. And remember, I can just take that 1,532. Billions means 10 to the ninth. So I can just say times 10 to the ninth. And then when I'm dealing with the population for Australia in 22.0 million, well, remember, that's 22 million or times 10 to the sixth power. All right, so then I can do my division. Remember, when I'm dividing with powers of 10, I'm going to be subtracting those exponents, numerator minus denominator, and you should have the final answer. Now, be careful when you're looking at numbers here. When we're talking money, unless it says to round out to the nearest whole dollar, you should round out to the nearest penny. So we were talking about money, so this is why everything is rounded out to the nearest penny. And you want to make sure it's rounded out correctly. So watch for that in WebWorks, because they are kind of particular about that. So watch if they want it rounded out to the nearest whole dollar. Otherwise, you would round it out to the nearest penny in this case. So now as we're looking at this, we can kind of analyze a little bit about what's going on here. As we're looking at it, per person, in this particular case, it's not as big of a number in Australia, but when we're dividing it per person, we actually get a big number, a GDP per person. So the cost of living is much higher in Australia, and part of that has to do with, think about it, it's an island. They don't produce everything on that big continent, that island there. And so a lot of things are imported. So the more goods and services that you would import, the more it's going to cost your citizens in the long run. All right. United States by far has the biggest GDP. All right. I mean, so in other words, we consume a lot. All right. We're materialistic in the United States, much more materialistic than some of the other countries. When you divide that out per person, we have the next highest value here of 51,000. So we would be the next highest cost of living out there. Now, when we look at it, China per person, okay, or the GDP, goods and services here, it's like about 800, I'm sorry, $8,227 billion. Okay, but remember, China's got a huge population. So when you divide that by the population, their GDP per capita is not as large as you would think. All right, so you know, we're dividing that out, so the goods and services are pretty much spread out. It's a different way of living. Okay, so this kind of tells us a little bit economically about some of the um, countries here. So I have a question. I'm confused. After we divide, where we were supposed to subtract it. Okay, I don't know where subtraction comes in. If you watch the last section videos on the per capita means you're just dividing per person. That's all that means. So that's all you want to do, is you just want to divide and then just make sure that it's in the correct format here. Where did we get the 7.67 billion from that previous question? Remember, we did our cross multiplication. Okay, so I would highly recommend that if you're not familiar with the videos, if you didn't get a chance to watch the videos last week, go and watch my video, and then go back and watch Becky's video, because I do an explanation in detail, and we also talk about scientific notation in detail. So you might want to maybe start with my video, because mine's an abbreviated version of Becky's, because she's got hers divided into that. Okay, so there's no subtraction here when we're doing per capita. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Okay. All right, so here's our numbers again. And so if we're doing a comparison here, you can see these would be some answers doing the comparisons. The more people there are in China, it's distributing that GDP. Okay. Now take a look. Here's another one of those what if scenarios here. So they're saying if China's GDP were proportional to Australia. So we're saying, what if China was like Australia? So that means we're going to use all of Australia's values. What would be China's expected GDP? So what are the two things I'm looking at? I'm looking at the GDP value. I'm looking at the population. So you want to set up your proportion. Okay. Remember, the amount that's going to be missing is going to be China's GDP value. We're still going to be using their population for China. Okay. And then here's Madagascar. So I'll give you a moment to copy these down. So remember, here's how we're setting it up. The top number is the GDP. The bottom number is the population. So you want to follow that same order over here on the opposite side of the proportion, but we're using all of Australia's information here. Okay, so remember, when we solve our proportion, we're going to do cross multiplication. So we're going to multiply the two numbers across from one another, and we're going to be dividing with the one opposite the x. All righty. And so in this case, they actually rounded it out. And then don't forget what units I'm dealing with. Notice we put these numbers in scientific notation. These numbers are too big to work with in a calculator. So we're going to have to remember, how do I work with scientific notation? When I'm multiplying powers of 10, I add the exponents. When I'm dividing powers of 10, I subtract the exponents. Numerator minus denominator. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Okay, and then if we were comparing Madagascar to the United States, you can see that we would say, wow, Madagascar is going to spend a lot more money on their goods and services. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you're looking at, in this case, who's got a higher standard of living. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about budgets, and we're going to get into talking a little bit about um, the government and the federal deficit and all that. So let's look at some basic definitions so we're familiar with that. I think everyone pretty much understands most of these values here, or these definitions. A budget, it's just a list of what you think you're going to spend based on what you actually going to spend. Income, any kind of sources of money. Usually, you receive it from your work pay. Sometimes it could be through rentals, uh, interest that you earn on things that you've invested. Expenses, these are all the things that we have to pay for, obviously. Now, when we say we have a surplus, that means at the end of the period, and usually when we're working up a budget, like a household budget, we usually do it per month. And so say at the end of the month, I've got money left over from what I expected to have spent, that's a surplus. But if I'm short some money and I owe money somewhere, or I have still a balance on my credit cards, that would be a deficit. So that my budget fell short that month. Savings, any accumulated surpluses, and debt, accumulated deficits. Okay, so understanding these basic definitions is going to help us talk about our federal budget here. Now, until we get to the federal budget, we're going to start by introducing a spreadsheet today. So this is our first definition. If you've never used Excel, I'm actually going to be showing you how to do a pie graph today, because this pie chart is going to be due next Monday. So you're going to have your first Excel homework assignment. And don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it, step by step. And you can rewatch this video over and over again. Okay, so let's take a look at a spreadsheet, because we are going to start getting into this, and I'll go into a spreadsheet a little bit more next week when I introduce our first project. So next week's class, I will introduce project number 1. All right, spreadsheets, they are Excel assignments here. We're going to be using Excel. Everyone has access to Microsoft Office because you are a student. So you can go on your My Ivy page, and then the left-hand corner, if you go to Student Resources, you can download the programs for free. Okay, and there's directions on how to do that. It's very easy. Actually, I had to download it onto my laptop, and so it was very easy to follow. All right, so the table is composed of, there you can see that it's a table. All right, so we've got columns here. The columns are alphabetical, so they go A, B, C, D, all the way to Z, and then they start repeating themselves, A, B, B, and so on. I have used spreadsheets that have been very huge, where I've had like a couple hundred columns. So it is possible to deal with things like that. And then you can see we have the rows, and the rows are numbered. So each one of these little boxes that you see over here with a number or some titles in it is called a cell. And each cell has a particular cell location. So let's say it says here, for example, the cell in the second column, so I'm going to go to the second column, in the third row, so 1, 2, 3, okay, we see the number 2000 here. That is cell B3. Okay, so we're going to use the cell locations next week when we're going to be setting up a little spreadsheet that's where you want to do some calculations on that. We want to make sure that when we're doing something like this, we use the cell location anytime we're going to be doing some calculations, because the great thing about this is, what if I accidentally put in a wrong number and I have to go back and change it? I don't want to have to remember where I had a calculation involving the number 2000 throughout the whole spreadsheet. But if I change it there once, if I've set up all my formulas and equations to use the cell location instead of the number 2000, then whatever number is in that cell is going to automatically update everywhere that that's being used. So that's really kind of a cool thing. And I'll show you more of that next week. Okay, so you can see here they're just going over a little bit more what is represented in column B. All right, so that's our estimated. The income from my job is in cell C5. Okay, I'm sorry, what is the, my job and any other incoming incomes here. So that would be my total income in C5. Okay, using the term surplus or deficit, write a meaningful sentence to describe the significance of the number in G10. Well, let's take a look over here. Here is row G and 10. Ooh, notice I've got some parentheses around this number, 210. Now, when I see numbers like that, that means there is a deficit. There's numerous ways to show a negative value or a deficit in Excel. And I'll show more of that next week when we start setting something up. But you can actually format the cells to do it in a number of different ways. You can have it make the number red, because you ever hear people saying, oh, this business is in the red. In other words, they owe money. So it could come up red. You can also make it look like a negative number. And so if it shows negative, that means I owe money. Or you can simply show a parentheses around it, which also stands for a negative value. So I'm $210 in the hole, or I have a deficit that month of my expected or my estimated expenses based on my total expenses. Now, there's actually an equation going on over here in one of these cell locations. Okay, so when we look over here, and we want to take a look at what is actually going on in this cell location. All right, let's take a look over here. Now, since I have clicked on this particular box here, it's going to tell me up here in the cell address what the name of that cell is. So this is G10. It's going to be at the top of that Excel sheet here. And it's also telling me in the formula bar, there's an equation going on here. All right. Now, in Excel, anytime you want something calculated, you want to know what a value is equal to, you want to start with an equal sign, because I want to figure out what's it equal to. So we would start out with an equal sign. And in this case, I'm just going to put in a simple formula, a subtraction here. So in this case, in order to get my income minus expenses, well, my actual income is here in cell G8. All right. And notice I just put the cell location G8. And you can do that by simply putting equal sign and just click on this location. And then I'm going to show minus, and then I'm going to click on the cell location, and it's going to automatically say G9. So now it's showing take whatever number is in G8 and subtract whatever value is in G9. Okay. And in that particular case, this value is going to show here as the number, and it's showing that it's a deficit here. Okay, so it's kind of interesting to see how this can actually help us here. And you can, just as this the basics and setting up just a very simple Excel spreadsheet here. And like I said, I will go over this in more detail next week. Okay, so we do have something called the sum location. The sum function. What does the word sum mean? Well, that means to add. So if I wanted to say add up all these expenses here, I could have just highlighted all of these and gone to the upper right-hand corner and just hit the little sum button, which looks kind of like a funky letter E. Okay, and then where might the sum function have been used to total this spreadsheet? Okay, and here's all different places where it could be used. Okay, so if you've never done anything like this before, this is just an introduction. I will definitely be doing this in more detail next week. So, make sure that you log on next week. You don't want to miss that, because I'll also be introducing what you will be required to do for project number 1, which is kind of like an extended homework problem, but it does have a written report along with it. Okay, so here is showing how you can type in sum, highlight the values here. So all of this is in your textbook. All right, so we're going to start working with some values here. And this is kind of interesting and depressing all at the same time. So according to the Government Publishing Office, and you can see anytime we are using numbers here that we refer to something, we always want to put the place where we got it, so we reference where we got this information from. We did use the most current when this was going to publication, this book got published at the end of summer last year, so we were only able to use 2017's value, so this is the most current. But you can see the federal government had income of $3.32 trillion. Now, take a look at the expenses, though. The expenses were $3.98 trillion. So the federal government is spending more than they're actually bringing in income. So this causes an issue. So if we calculate the difference between these, in other words, we're going to subtract income minus expenses, just like we did on that spreadsheet there. So this is like the federal government's budget now. You can see we have a negative 0.66 trillion. Now, notice we just use the abbreviated versions of the numbers. I didn't put these in scientific notation form. And the reason why is because both of them had the same units here. They both had the units of $1 trillion. So that made my life so much easier. So all I can do is just do the subtraction between the numbers, and then I don't want to forget to add that unit on at the end. Okay, now remember, if you watch my video there, or I think we've talked about this, the U.S. government and news stations like to abbreviate numbers. So 0.66 trillion means that there's no trillions. So we would go to the next. So this means $660 billion. Okay, so remember how they abbreviate those numbers there, what that means. Okay, now, if the average citizen with a per capita income of this $46,000 number here, if we acted like the U.S. federal government, what would be the expenses for that citizen? So what they're doing is they're saying, what if, this is a what if scenario, what if the normal citizen acted like the federal government? Now, comparatively, we can't use the income of the federal government because that's bigger. So we're going to use the income of the typical average citizen. All right, so we're going to see how much if it was us, how much are we, in other words, overspending in our terms here. So we're going to set up a ratio here, expenses to income ratios, and we're going to set up that scenario here. Now, in this case, remember, we're talking about population per capita, and so in this case, we want to make sure that we are using the values for using scientific notation whenever possible. Now, in this particular case, the monies are in the trillions, which means those units are going to cancel each other out over here. So this is okay to use the abbreviated version of the numbers, okay? Because these would cancel each other out, numerator to denominator. So once again, I've got my setting this up, my proportion here, multiply the numbers across from one another, divide with the one opposite the x. And in this case, you can see if I'm a citizen who makes $46,550 and I were acting and overspending like the federal government, Comparatively, that means I'm spending more than what I'm making, almost $10,000 more than what I'm making. So yeah, the federal government is definitely spending. So in our terms, you can see what that would be like. So, we would be in a deficit there. Okay, so this is a good quiz or test question again. Remember those what if scenarios. Make sure you understand how to do those. Okay, now, assuming that the U.S. population in 2017 were this value, can we calculate the per capita deficit? Well, we already figured that the deficit was a negative 0.66 trillion or 660 billion. Now, if we divide that by the number of people, remember, so that would be the deficit per person, per capita. Basically, we would say that each person, in order to pay off our federal deficit, and we're including everyone, every child, every senior citizen, and everyone in between, everyone would have to pay over $2,000 just to pay off that 2017 deficit. Okay, so interesting. Notice, okay, the units were different. So we use scientific notation. Remember, first divide your decimals. Then you want to divide with your powers of 10. And remember, in this case, since I have the same base number, I'm going to be taking numerator minus denominator here. And that's how we get per person. Now, compare this with the per capita income. And can we have some interesting things to say? So here would be, something that you might want to write about. There's really no one way of answering some of these questions, but as long as you are addressing the question and your statement makes sense, I'll give you credit for it. So you don't have to worry about, well, how do I properly say it? Kind of think about what's the question there. So take a look at how they explain that. Okay, so I had a question. Why didn't we turn 326 into 3.26? So if you watched last week's video, remember you can do the abbreviated version. Millions is the same thing as 10 to the 6th power when we were talking about scientific notation. And so unless it tells us first convert it to scientific notation, we can just use the unit as the power of 10 and then worry about the final answer at the end. And since it made sense to put my answer in the form of money, we left it in standard form. So yeah, good question out there. So yeah, sometimes, we want to put it into scientific notation form, but if we're not looking for the answer until the very end, we can just say, okay, millions means 10 to the 6, and that's 326. So that's why I did that. When the power is negative, it's confusing how to figure out what the power will end up being. Okay, basically you want to follow the rules of positive and negative numbers. Okay, so let's say in this particular case, this 6, say this was a negative value for the exponent here. All right, so remember, we always do numerator minus denominator. So following the rules of working with what they call integers. So if the bottom number here were a -6, this would be 12 minus a -6. Well, remember the rules with positive negative numbers. Whenever I'm subtracting a negative, it's like adding the opposite. And honestly, use your calculator to help you with this if you can't remember the rules. So you would say 12 minus a -6, which is the same thing as adding the opposite or adding a +6, which would actually mean 10 to the 18th power. So just remember, these are just the rules of positive and negative numbers there. But use your calculator to your advantage there. Definitely put those numbers into your calculator if you can't remember the rules. So good question. All righty, so let's take a look. I'll put these two answers up here. And this is the part in our class that I want to check in and make sure that everyone is here. So what I'd like everyone to do is just in the chat box over here, just type hi or hello, and I'm just going to double check that everyone is still with us to get your attendance points here. And while you're copying these two questions down. Perfect. I see those coming in. Okay, so I'll just give you a few minutes to write those in while I'm double checking who's all still with us. Okay. All right, so here's something that you might run into on an exam where maybe we might give you some graphics and we might ask you, can you tell us something about it, or can you compare and contrast some graphics and what do you see? All right, so I'm going to talk you through how would I answer a question like this. All right, so occasionally I do see these problems show up, so I want to make sure you would know what to do. First of all, if they showed you something like these two graphics and they said, you know, compare and contrast or put a couple different sentences about this or whatever, do not tell me the first graph shows the deficit and surplus. The second graph shows the accumulated debt. All you did was tell me the titles of the graph, which is what I can read for myself. So if you just tell me the titles of the graph, you'll get no points for that. So I'm telling you ahead of time, don't just relist the points. Instead, if they're giving you a graphic, the first thing you want to do is, you know, look and see what doesn't look right. What do I see jumps out at me in these graphics? Is there anything different about something? Or, you know, is there something similar in both of these cases here? Well, when I look at the first one, this part right here where the bars are pointing upwards, that's what jumps up at me. Now, since they're talking about a deficit or a surplus, and this is basically my 0 point, because remember, negative numbers are a debt and positive numbers are a surplus. In this case, it's showing late 1990s, maybe up to the year 2000, we actually had a surplus in the federal government. Okay, so now when I'm comparing it over here to the other graphic, and you know, how does this relate during the same time frame? Let's take a look at those same exact years here. Well, notice what's happening. In those two particular years, we didn't get any additional accumulated debt because the surplus actually showed an increase. All right. So we had a surplus. Our debt didn't increase. So, we kind of just stayed the same. Unfortunately, after that, things shot up dramatically. Okay, and then remember we had the recession and we were lending money to some of the banks, lending money to the car the GM and all that. So the federal government, really got in debt during that time frame. So you can see that accumulated debt over time. So if you were going to write something, look for something that stands out as different. And then how would that compare maybe in the other graphic that's related to that? All right, so that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so you can see here's some possible answers here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about inflation and the consumer price index. Now, inflation is basically the rise in the prices of these goods and services. So, the CPI is what we refer to as the Consumer Price Index. Now, the CPI is basically a monthly number, and that kind of shows the changes within prices of a representative basket of goods and services. Now, you can look at this list. I've actually looked up this list once before because I was just kind of curious. This comes from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and it says there are more than 60,000 goods and services and housing costs. And really there are. So if you're interested, look it up. You know, it's kind of interesting to see that. It's just amazing how many goods and services that are on that list. And then we keep track of the prices of these things from month to month. And then we also comprise an annual. And typically when we're looking at something, we're looking at it from one point to exactly a year later. And then that's how we can relate the inflation rate. So a CPI table might look something like this. And notice in this case, they're not giving us a monthly, they're giving us the total annual rate. All right, so you can see we've got 1997, and here was the CPI value all the way up to 2017, and here was the CPI value here, prices of goods and services. All right, when we look at this, we see the trends, for the most part, if we're looking at all these values, they are increasing. Okay, so you can see they are going up. Unfortunately, they are going up. So things are worth, or, you know, we're paying more money. But remember, we had that recession. All right, when the recession came, and that was around 2008, notice what happened. Goods and services, the CPI value was 215 and some decimals, and it actually went down. It went down a little. Now, the reason why it went down is because a lot of people were losing their jobs at that time. And so you couldn't increase the price of goods and services because nobody could afford to pay for them. So companies were forced at that time, and if you remember, even gasoline prices came way down. Companies were forced to bring the prices down so they could at least make smaller profit than normal or break even. So the CPI values, or the inflation rate, actually dipped within that year. But then you can see after that, it's once again, it's steadily increased. So when we look at this over time, here's that dip right here. And you can see then, and we know what was going on in our country at the time. All right, so what if I wanted to compare the price of a McDonald's hamburger? So what if I did something like this? So in 1979, McDonald's hamburgers cost 38 cents. What would that equate to in 2015 dollars? Well, let's set up that proportion. Now, the proportion that I've been using in all of my examples, and if you've watched the video, has been the second method over here, where I first look and see what are the two things I'm comparing. So I'm comparing the cost of the hamburger based on the CPI value, the inflation rate. Okay, now notice I'm not going to use the year, I'm going to use the actual CPI value. So here's what it was worth in 1979. I'm trying to figure out what it would be in 2015 dollars, and then I have to pencil in those inflation rates. So if we did that and penciled in those inflation rates and did my cross multiplication, you can see that that would be $1.24. Okay, and yeah, that makes sense. $1.24 would make a lot of sense. So how does this compare? The price is comparable to what would be found on the dollar menu, but most burgers cost more than $1.24. Okay, so yeah, it's comparative though. Makes sense. Okay, here's a couple other ones. I'm just going to put those answers out there for you to copy down. Okay, so what would be a comparable starting salary? So in this case, we're saying, all right, here's what the salary was in 1983. What is it going to be for somebody in 2013 based on inflation? And we can see that that price went up to over 58,000. And now what if we went backwards from 1983 backwards to 1977? What would those values be? And comparatively, it would only be a salary of 15,000. Okay, so you can use this to see, what values would be worth in the future or what the same value would have been worth in the past. So hint, hint, you will see some sort of CPI question on the exam or the quiz. Hint, hint. So that's why I want to make sure you copy those down here. Okay, here's a couple more. We're comparing the price of soda. Suppose a 20-ounce can cost 25 cents in 1977. What's the cost in 2015? Well, it would be 98 cents. How does this compare to the actual cost of a soda? Okay, right now, yeah, price of sodas are actually more, so they've increased faster than inflation. Okay, so that might be a statement that you could make. Okay, here's just a couple more. Okay, I wanted to get to this minimum wage question here. What is the current minimum wage in Indiana? And I do believe it's about $7.25. I'm not 100% sure. And even my class thought it was about 7.25 last week. Okay, what is the ratio of the current minimum wage to that of 1979? So notice the ratio, it's telling you what order to put that in. Okay, so it's the 7.25 divided by the $2 for 1979. And I get this value. So remember, when we're doing the ratio, it means so many of the numerator per one of the denominator. So in other words, it's 3.625 times greater than in 1980. Okay, because it's this many per one of the denominator. So for every dollar in 2017, it's $3 and it's about 63 cents more compared to what was in 1970. Can we use the CPI table to determine whether the minimum wage has kept up with inflation since 1979? Well, take a look. We already know what the CPI value was here. We already know, the minimum wage here. We already know what the minimum wage is here. I've already got the answers here. So this is going to be one of those what if scenarios. So what we want to do is we want to start with 1979 information, and we want to see if I calculate based on inflation, will I get the answer of 725? So hint, hint. This is going to be something you might want to be knowing how to do for the quiz or the exam. Hint, hint. You can check if answers are correct if you have both sets of data. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by using this 79 info and confirming if this answer is correct or not. So I'm going to set it up with my CPI values of 1979. Okay, and I'm going to compare it to that 2017. So I'm going to set up that ratio. Okay, and if I calculated the minimum wage according to CPI tables is only going to be $5.95. But when we look at the actual value, because remember, this is the what if. So we're saying what if, so we're using all the values of 79, the CPI and the minimum wage, and we're using the CPI for 2017, and we're seeing what would the minimum wage be if I followed inflation rates. We come up with the 595, and so we can say, wow, inflation is $5.95, but the minimum wage is actually more than what the inflation rate is allowing. So we're actually getting more. It went past the inflation rate. Okay, so you can use this idea of the CPI to verify if answers are correct or not. Okay, and that's pretty much what I have for you for this section. I'm going to try to just introduce section 5 right here. Oops, sorry. Let me get back to section 5. I'm just going to start introducing working with percentages. Most of this you already know. So I'm going to blow this up over here. I just want to look at the general idea here, and we'll go through this next week some more. So don't worry about that. You know, we're skipping something if we don't get through it all today. We'll be able to get that. Okay. Ooh, I missed that question. Where is the 60.6 coming from? So as soon as I get through this, Jessica, I'll try to go back. Okay. So in this case, when we're solving statements with percent, the most popular way of solving anything with percentages involved is using the proportion method by far. And the reason why is when I'm using the proportion method, everything is going to be in the correct format. I don't have to worry about changing my percents to a decimal and then back to a percent because I've already got it as part of my equation here. I have percent over 100. So it automatically adjusts for that. In this section, we do go through both of these methods. So you can do either the proportion method or the equation method, whatever you're more comfortable with. It's fine with me. But I'm going to be basing it on the proportion method, which I would say 99% of my students use. Okay, so the hardest part when we're going to be working with statements is figuring out which is the amount and which is the base. Sometimes we say is over of. Another way of looking at it is part out of the whole. Okay, and so you can see these definitions here. So if we go to this next page here, amount over base is equal to the percent out of 100. So let's just look at a very quick example here for those of you who want to start working a little bit of ahead. What amount is 20% of 160? Well, anytime we have been given the percent, we're just going to take that percent and put it where the percent would be. And notice I didn't do any conversions. I just used the number as is, 20 out of 100 here. Okay, so it's asking us what amount. That's what I'm trying to find. So this is going to be my variable up here, or the thing I'm looking for, and then of 160. So my base amount is where I began. The amount is always related to the percent. So think about it. These numerators are always related to one another. So after I took 20%, that's what should be the amount here. So I know since 20% is less than 100%, this amount should be less than 160. All right, so if we do our cross multiplication and solve that, okay, we're going to multiply the two numbers across from one another, divide with the one with the x, I get 32, which makes sense. It's smaller than the other value there. Here's another example. 72 is 40% of what number? Of is what I'm looking for. Of what number? I'm looking for the base. So here's how I would set it up. Remember, 40% is given, so I'm going to put that there. And it says 72 is 40%. So 72 already is related to the 40%. So remember, these are related, so they're both in the numerator. Now my denominator should be bigger because this is not 100%, and it is 180. And then just one last example. 60 is what percent of 200? So is over of. So here is 60 over 200. I'm looking for the percent, do my cross multiplication, and I get 30. Now, it's already in the correct format. All you have to do is add the percent sign. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is using the proportion method. So I will pick it up from this point forward on next week. But if you have any questions, if you're starting to look ahead, don't forget you've got Becky's videos out there. You do have a homework assignment due today. You've got that first quiz due. I noticed about half of you haven't done that first quiz, so make sure you get that in before tonight. And you want to keep up with that homework. If you didn't get the opportunity to watch section 3 from last week, you want to make sure that you go to that home page. Let me see if I can click on that. So if you go to our homepage for our class, here are the synchronous sessions, and here are the course videos. These are Becky's videos for all the sections here. These are my videos, so this is going to take you to my YouTube channel, which once I'm done formatting this, it's going to take you. So remember, this is pre-recorded from last semester. So it shows section 3, and this is session 2. So this is session 1 here. So I will be posting those there. So I'll hang out if you have any other questions. I'll hang out on the line. And Jessica, I'm hoping maybe I can figure out your question here. And otherwise, you're free to go, and just be careful with that snow out there. Take it easy out there. And talk with you next week. Okay, so if you want to ask me a question, go ahead and type it into the box, or you can undo your mute, because I had muted everybody just in case. Otherwise, shoot me an email later. I'd be happy to help. So I'm going to try to figure out, Jessica, your question. Let me see if I can figure out, where's the 60.6 coming from?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, because you were going over the I think we were going back the government.
Okay.
I think it was from one of those questions, and I saw that you had 60.6 on one of the problems you had did, and I just wasn't understanding where the 60.6 came from.
Okay, that must have been this one here.
Yeah, right
Okay.
there. Yep.
Okay. So
well, not the
this,
government, the soda.
yeah, I would say if I kept going back slide by slide, I figured I'd see it. Okay, so if we go to the slide before it.
Hello?
Okay. Hello?
Is my thing
Hello,
acting
can you
up?
hear? Okay.
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Hello?
Hello? I can hear you. Okay, I'm going to type this in.
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Okay, so what would be comparable salaries? So that's 60.6. Hopefully you can hear me or hear.
I can't hear
It's
anything.
coming here.
What's going on?
Hello? Let me see.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I think my speaker on my computer is acting funny. Hello? Yes. Why is it doing this? Can you hear me? Hello? What in the heck? I can't hear you. Try putting this in again. Hello? Hello? Oh my gosh, what is going on?